Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on Institutional Compliance Responding to Online Accessibility Legal Issues. This session serves as the first in our two-part virtual pre-conference on the road to electronic information accessibility. How do we increase student success? I'm Erin Elsie, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. As part of this webinar, we have two presentations today. The first, University EIT Accessibility Compliance, Southern New Hampshire University's Action Plan for Electronic Information Technology Accessibility, will be presented by Casey Fleetwood and Cheryl Irvin. Casey Fleetwood is the ADA Coordinator and Compliance Administrator for Southern New Hampshire University, and she has worked in education for over 2 decades, with 10 of those years in higher education. Casey has a Bachelor of Science degree in Management with a certificate in Business and Technical Communications from the Georgia Institute of Technology, teaching certification through Armstrong Atlantic State University, and a Master of Science continuing education degree in Counseling and Psychology from the University of West Alabama. As a parent of a child with a disability, a former K-12 teacher, and as a university ADA coordinator, Casey sees the world of accommodations and accessibility needs through a broad lens. After a short detour into the world of government internal auditing in a California county serving over 1 million people, education called Casey back, and she brought a wealth of auditing knowledge with her. Casey's multifaceted viewpoint on meeting the needs of students with disabilities, coupled with her strong auditing background and recognition of regulatory requirements, has enabled Casey to lead a large-scale accessibility improvement project at SNHU that is gaining momentum, buy-in, and positive results. Her co-presenter, Cheryl Irvin, has been with Southern New Hampshire University for 7 years and has been working with the General Counsel Office since 2014. Cheryl's work for the university involves maintaining compliance with state authorization regulations, in addition to a variety of compliance-related university-wide initiatives. Notable accomplishments include crafting a number of tracking reports, management of required state regulations and filings, as well as management of the renewal filings associated with their SARA participation. Cheryl graduated summa cum laude from Southern New Hampshire University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration and as a certified project management professional. The second presentation, Compliance or Bust, Accessibility and the Office of Civil Rights and Seton Hall University Libraries, will be given by Elizabeth Leonard. Elizabeth is the Assistant Dean of Information Technologies and Collection Services. She holds an MLIS from Rutgers University, a Master's in Urban Planning from the Wagner School of Public Service at NYU, and doctoral work in clinical psychology with an APA-approved program. Elizabeth's background spans over 20 years working in the field of information technology and libraries, including stints with NYU, Coach Leatherware, and the Department of Defense. She specializes in project management, systems development, digital librarianship, library administration, and now accessibility. Her book, Virtually Embedded, The Librarian in an Online Environment, with co-editor Erin McCaffrey, was published by ACRL in 2014. She is the past president of ACRL New Jersey and has published and presented on the subject of accessibility, online libraries, virtual embedded librarianship, marketing of online library services, and the value of academic libraries. A few logistics for today's presentations. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSAC18. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for questions at the end of each presentation, so please be sure to enter your questions for the first set of presenters before we move on to the second presentation. If we do not get to your question, our presenters have kindly agreed to answer remaining questions in writing, which will be sent out to attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. Before we get started, the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee would like to give an extra special thank you to our co-sponsor for this week's virtual pre-conference sessions, the ALCTS CMS Collections Development Librarians of Academic Libraries Interest Group. And now we'll start with Casey. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Casey Fleetwood, and my co-presenter, Cheryl Irwin. We're both with the General Counsel and Compliance Office. As Aaron introduced us, we work for Southern New Hampshire University. So just to give you a little bit of context of the accessibility issues that we are dealing with, we are a very large institution. We serve about 100,000 students, probably a little over that now, in our College of Online and Continuing Education programs online. We serve about 6,000 students through our online competency-based education programs. Those are also online. And we serve about 3,400 of your traditional coming-of-age students at our residential campus in Manchester, New Hampshire. So we have a lot of content that is shared electronically. Our library and the content we share electronically through the library is massive. So we decided to closely take a look at where we are with accessibility, because there have been a lot of attention in this area and a lot of schools that have had to go into monitoring agreements, resolution agreements with OCR, Department of Justice. And so we decided that we wanted to be proactive, and we wanted to go ahead and get ahead of the curve, take a look at where we are and what we need to do to improve accessibility. So our presentation today is going to go into more detail about where we started and where we are headed. So on this first screen, we have a picture of our library learning commons, and this is one of our newest buildings that's new that we are very proud of. As we go through our presentation, Cheryl and I are going to try to incorporate really good universal design practices. So we'll describe any images we may have on our slides, clearly identify when we move from one slide to the next. These are just small things that help vision impaired audience members move along with presentations, things to keep in mind. These are small things we're doing throughout the university to try to improve accessibility just a little bit more with each step. So the topics we're covering today, for those who don't know how much background you might have in accessibility law, so we're briefly going to touch on accessibility law. We'll talk a little bit about legal actions that have been taken against some institutions. We'll talk about the WCAG standards, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Who benefits from accessibility? We'll talk about that very briefly. And then we'll talk about SNU conducting an accessibility audit of our website and our student portal, lessons that we learned from that audit, and then the plan, the initiative that we have built from that to improve accessibility across the board. And our library is actually a little bit ahead of the game with some of that work that they are doing, so we'll share that as well. So there are three primary sources of federal disability law for those who aren't quite as familiar with accessibility and where it falls into things. So we've got the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. We have Section 504 and 508. And both of those say that a person cannot be excluded solely due to disability or discriminated against if they are disabled or if they are regarded as disabled, and if they are otherwise qualified to participate in a federally funded program. So as long as students are academically, mentally, physically qualified to participate in a program, they cannot be excluded or discriminated against simply because of a disability. So you have to work to modify information to give it to them in an accessible format. The other regulatory agency, or law, I should say, is Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, as it was amended in 2008. It says basically the same thing. You cannot discriminate against an individual on the basis of disability. And then you have the Department of Justice as well, excuse me, through the Department of Education. And the DOJ says that institutions must provide technology in an equally effective and equally integrated manner. So taking that phrase and trying to figure out what they mean by it is, they mean that you must provide the same information at the same time and in the same place to people with disabilities that you would to people without disabilities. It doesn't mean that the information has to be identical, but it does mean that it must be presented in a format that is equally effective, provided same time, same place. So even though we have these laws that tell us that we must comply with accessibility, they don't tell us how to do that. So Section 504, the ADA, they say you must be accessible, but it doesn't give any standards or any guidelines on how to be accessible, what those requirements are. So that's where we have to look at Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And even though that law applies to federal agencies, that is usually the law that is referenced for national accessibility benchmarks. And Section 508 went through something they call a recent refresh in October of last year, where they improved some of the standards, and it's called WCAG 2.0. And that's a very specific set of standards that tells you exactly what you need to do to demonstrate compliance with the law. Now, there is an update to WCAG 2.0, and that's 2.1 that is expected to be released this month. So there's a lot of interest in some of the changes that are coming up with 2.1, but that's the standard that's followed right now. And then also another thing that institutions will do, and you're probably familiar with this in your libraries if you work with vendors, is VPATs, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Templates. Vendors apply the WCAG 2.0 benchmarks to their products when they are providing VPATs. So that's why we refer to WCAG a lot when we're talking about accessibility. So when it comes to enforcement of all these laws, who enforces it? Well, you've got the Department of Education through the Office of Civil Rights. They enforce Section 504 if your school receives federal financial assistance. The Department of Justice through the Civil Rights Division enforces ADA through Titles II and Titles III. So Title II covers your public colleges and universities. Title III covers private colleges and universities. And then on top of that, you also have aggrieved individuals who can file private lawsuits. They sometimes work with disability advocacy groups who will file on their behalf, law firms that can help enforce their rights. So there are a lot of different ways that enforcement can impact you in the areas of accommodations and accessibility. So to give you an idea of the breadth of schools that these enforcement agencies have been looking at, all of these schools have recent enforcement actions or lawsuits related to accessibility. And you'll see that it's a very wide variety of schools. You've got community colleges, state colleges, private colleges. You've got your tier ones, your Harvard, your MIT, you've got your state universities. It seems no one has been immune, no particular sector has been immune. We've even got some for-profits on there. So no one is immune to these types of enforcement actions or lawsuits. And if you want more detail, a lot of these schools have posted either their resolution agreements or their enforcement agreements on their website, or they have more robust websites dedicated to accessibility. So you can certainly check out what these schools are doing. And it seems like over time, the enforcements are getting more and more detailed, and the requirements are increasing. Miami University in Ohio, their consent decree covers one of the broadest ranges of EIT that I have seen in any of these consent decrees so far. So it includes their websites, their LMS, instructional support systems. So in their LMS, if they have third-party support systems like My Math Lab, includes things like that. And another thing that is interesting about the Miami consent decree is that it also included individual monetary relief to the student and the student, and so they had to pay attorney's fees, expert fees, and there were monetary damages to the student as well. So because the enforcement seems to be getting more aggressive, and we don't want our name on that list, Southern New Hampshire University began our own accessibility remediation plan. So we said we don't want to become a target, and it's the right thing to do to improve accessibility for all of our students, so let's do it. So to get started, we first have to figure out where we are. So what are the problems that we have, creating a plan, how are we going to go about remediating it? And so Cheryl's going to go into a little bit more detail about the discovery process that we went through with our audit in her part of the presentation. So Cheryl's going to start us off. I'm going to transfer the mic to her in just a moment. She's going to talk about WCAG and what our university did first with a website audit. Cheryl?
Thank you, Casey. As Casey touched upon, some of you may be familiar with the acronym WCAG, which stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The guidelines were developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, and they're also referred to sometimes as the W3C. And through that, they have also created the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI, all in an effort to improve the accessibility of the web for people with disabilities. The current set of guidelines, WCAG 2.0, have been in place since 2008. And as Casey mentioned, the refresh, WCAG 2.1, is set to release this summer. It does not replace 2.0, but instead provides some updates as well as the addition of 17 new guidelines that focus on improving accessibility for users with cognitive disabilities and users who browse websites on mobile devices such as tablets and smartphones. And as we know, young people now, they're using their tablets and smartphones in lieu of many other kind of standard conventional computer types of content delivery. The WCAG guidelines are designed around a set of 4 principles with, you guessed it, another acronym, POUR, P-O-U-R, which stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. The guidelines are organized into 3 levels of conformance or success criteria: level A, level AA, level AAA. For most websites, level AA with some level AAA is the best target, simply because some of the level AAA guidelines simply can't be applied to all websites. But remember that each level includes the level below and the additional requirements at the higher level. It would be a disservice not to review the success criteria of the highest level and aim to reach that highest level of conformance possible. It's also important to mention that the majority of resolution agreements specifically direct institutions to meet the WCAG 2.0 level AA standard, since it does represent the level with the most common and problematic issues for web users. Slide 8, please, Casey. So who benefits from accessibility? Improved accessibility not only benefits enrolled students, it also benefits prospective students, their family members, and the general public. In fact, according to the Section 508.gov website, nearly 1 in 8 people in the United States have a disability. One author actually defines accessibility as ability plus a barrier equaling disability. Content must be accessible for those who may be legally blind, but it's also important for those with low vision or those who may be deaf or hearing impaired. I've included neurological reactions in intellectual disabilities because they may not be some of the most common disabilities that one might consider. Folks with disabilities access and navigate the web in a variety of ways. Some are keyboard dependent and can't use a mouse. Instead, they rely on assistive technology such as screen readers, screen magnifiers, and even voice recognition software. An added bonus of improved accessibility is assistance for those individuals for whom English is a second language, since they may benefit from captions and written content. Also, those with multiple learning styles also benefit from a combination of visual and auditory content delivery. Slide 9, please, Casey. Conducting an accessibility audit. There is some pre-planning that must take place before launching an accessibility audit. At SNHU, After reviewing our various assets, we identified our public-facing website and our student portal as the areas of focus for the audit. Depending on the size of your organization, you might consider including your library resources as well. As Casey mentioned, our library has already done some work in that regard. The next step in the audit planning process includes identifying the key stakeholders from each of the asset areas to become your partner and a member of the audit working group. At SNHU, we don't like the term committees. Instead, we prefer to assemble working groups. So task your working group with researching the audit firms most aligned with your end result in mind, as there are a fair number of accessibility audit firms from which to choose, and each offers varying types of accessibility auditing services. We chose to tap into the expertise of our procurement office to create a request for proposal, or RFP, for the audit firms that were identified. While not required, if you have a procurement office, their knowledge of the contracting process can be particularly valuable. Once you've sent the RFPs to the identified firms and received their responses, you'll want to schedule interviews with the firms to discuss their work experience, conducting accessibility audits for organizations similar to yours. And don't forget to vet their references by calling and asking specific questions about their experiences with the audit firm. Did they stay on budget? Did they complete the audit on schedule? Did they provide a full and complete report of the audit findings, etc.? Once you've selected an audit firm, you'll want to work with them to determine the timeline for completion. If the content to be audited is quite large, you may even want to negotiate a preliminary findings meeting to get a sense of the general categories of findings. And of course, once you receive the audit findings, you are on notice and need to have a plan in place to remediate the findings. While it isn't necessary or feasible to tackle everything at once, the asset owners who are part of your working group must work within their areas to create a detailed remediation plan to work through the required updates. And lastly, share what you've learned widely with your organization. Create a summary of lessons learned, or better yet, a brief presentation, and reach out to the institution to raise awareness of accessibility and universal design. You don't want to go through the expense of conducting an accessibility audit and the work of remediating the findings, only to learn that newly created content does not meet accessibility guidelines. Slide 10, please, Casey. Lessons learned from the SNHU accessibility audit. So I've provided an overview of conducting an accessibility audit in the previous slide, and I talked about the importance of sharing the lessons learned. Now I'd like to share some of the lessons SNHU learned from our accessibility audit. Successful keyboard navigation and assistive technology users depend on the correct use of page regions, both from a main navigation and sub-navigation aspect. Equally important are the use of ARIA labels and descriptive text that is only exposed for assistive technology users. Headings communicate the content organization of the page, and web browsers, plugins, and assistive technologies can use them for page navigation. Headings should be nested by their rank or level, with the most important headings with a rank of H1 and the least important heading with a rank of H6. Tooltips are pop-up messages typically triggered by moving a mouse over a control or widget, which causes a small pop-up window to appear with additional information about the content. Alternative text, also referred to as an alt tag, provides a textual alternative to non-text content in web pages. alt tags are read by screen readers in place of an image, allowing the content and function of the image to be accessible to those with visual or certain cognitive disabilities. Accessible PDFs are often confused with tagged PDF documents, even though there is more to an accessible PDF than tags. PDF tags provide a hidden, structured, textual representation of the PDF content that is presented to screen readers. They exist for accessibility purposes and have no visible effect on the PDF file. The use of color and color contrast is important to provide enough contrast between the content and the background for anyone with low vision impairments and color deficiencies. Text and non-decorative image need to be clearly legible for everyone, and there are a number of color contrast checker tools available online. In the previous slide, I spoke about creating page content that is easily navigated by non-mouse and keyboard-dependent users. A defined focus box provides an outline to form fields and/or other elements as the page is traversed via keyboard navigation, and it provides a visual marker indicating the focus on a web page element. Lastly, users who have photosensitive seizure disorder can be triggered by content that flashes at certain frequencies for more than a few flashes. And the WCAG 2.3.2 success criterion requires that web pages not contain anything that flashes more than 3 times in any 1 second period. So as you can see, we came away from our accessibility audit far more informed about a variety of accessibility standards and requirements. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Casey.
Thank you, Cheryl. So Cheryl helped lead SNOO's efforts through the accessibility audit. And the first takeaway that we had was, as Cheryl mentioned earlier, once you do an audit, you're on notice of the things that you need to remediate. So we started out with fixing the problems that were identified in that accessibility audit on our public-facing web page. That was the area of highest risk, where we had the most number of people coming to our web page, and we wanted to make sure that we fixed all of the accessibility areas that needed to be remediated that had been identified in the audit. And then as that work was taking place and Cheryl was helping to manage that, I started moving forward with managing a large-scale program that has multiple projects within that program. This all related to EIT accessibility, and we call it EIT, Electronic Information Technology, our accessibility plan. We call it EIT because that's what a lot of what OCR often refers to is in their resolution agreements is EIT, so we just kind of picked it up from them. So what we wanted to do was develop a plan that would look at accessibility across the whole entire university and first document where we are, and from that we wanted to make sure that we incorporate universal design concepts, that we're kind of expanding what we're looking at more from a holistic perspective, and document where we are, what our strategic plan is going to be. So at the end, we have something to measure it against. And then as we are going through and making improvements, we want to make sure that we are documenting as well, so that if we ever get challenged, we can show at least what we've done to date and what our plan is that might help with any type of conversations around deficiencies that we have. So even though our plan is such a wide focus and it covers every aspect of our university, it does include our library, and our plan is actually applicable at a smaller scale. So all of the steps that we're taking, even though we're taking these university-wide, these are same steps that could be taken just within your library if you're only looking at your library's accessibility. So we've been working on documenting our current state, creating our strategic plan, and then documenting the accessibility. We're looking at it from the student perspective, from the prospective student perspective, from our staff and employees perspective, and also from guests and visitors. So we're not just looking at the student experience. We are also reviewing all of our course content that's delivered electronically, both online and in our face-to-face classes, and we're creating a remediation plan. So this is a pretty big part of our plan. It's going to take some time. We estimate 18 to 24 months from start to finish to get us through the plan, and then after that is going to be ongoing continual maintenance and monitoring to make sure that we continue with all of the great work and efforts that we've put in place. So when we're looking at the EIT course content, we're looking at the content in our LMS. So we're looking at both the published or produced content. We're looking at content that is added by instructors or that is linked to by instructors. That can often be a problem from web pages if you have links taking the viewer to an external website. If that content needs to be consumed for them to take the next step, you want to make sure that that linked material is also accessible to the viewer. So we're also looking at our ebooks. We're looking at learning resources that might be embedded in those classes, such as like My Math Lab or any of that third-party vendor content that might be added as supplements. So it's very, very far-reaching. And even though this is, most people think, okay, that's your online classes. Well, it can be face-to-face classes too, because we have a lot of instructors who do use online as well. Like they might post their syllabi and have students upload assignments into the LMS, so, or they might provide PowerPoints and et cetera in their class. So any type of electronic content that has to be consumed is going to be included in our review and remediation plan. So another step that we are following is completing a prioritized technology inventory. So we're looking at all of the technology, the systems, the software, the applications that are used throughout the whole university, and it's pretty massive. I mean, we've got, you know, well over 100,000 students. We offer more than 200 programs just online, plus our CBE courses and our face-to-face courses. So there's a lot of technology that's being used, and just collecting a complete inventory has taken some time, but it's been very beneficial because then we've been able to prioritize that inventory. So what we've done is we're taking a look at what is the most student-facing high-risk technologies or applications that we have. So we're turning to our disability services offices, and this may be helpful in the library context too when you're looking at resources that students are using. So with our students who are registered with disability services, what are the resources that they have already complained to us about that there might be accessibility issues? And those go to the top of our priority list for remediation. And then secondly would be also just looking at metrics. What are the pages? What are the systems that students are in most often in those, but maybe we haven't heard any complaints about them, but we still need to check them out for accessibility. And so they go into our second tier. And then our third tier are the systems or applications or websites that aren't accessed quite as frequently, or that may be more internal, so it's on the employee side. We know that's important, we need to fix that, but it's just lower on our priority list. We want to tackle student-facing first because they are our customers. So after we have our three-tier inventory completed, then we're going to conduct an accessibility audit, which is also going to take time. And that audit is going to be looking at each one of those technologies individually, doing some testing with them. Some of it can be done with automated testing, some of it would need to be manual testing, and then create a remediation plan from that. So our library right now is using an automated tested tool that they have dropped on the library website to help them identify accessibility issues. Now, our library is huge with a lot of resources, so they're not looking at every single page, every single piece of content. They're doing it in chunks. So they have run some analytics on what are the most used pages, and that's what they're targeting first. So they're using this automated testing tool to help them identify what the errors are that need to be fixed, and then creating a remediation plan that includes who's going to make all of the changes, how are we going to document that they have been completed and rectified, and then monitored moving forward. Slide 12. Continuing on with the plan, steps in our plan, is training. Training is huge. we can't have our small working groups fixing everything for the entire university. It's just not possible. And material is constantly being added all the time. So we would constantly be trying to play catch up if we were tasking this to just a few individuals. So we are creating training documents on a variety of accessibility topics. And we have created a section on our internal portal that has our accessibility project. It's going to house all of our training materials so they can be accessed on demand. So the different training materials, how to make a Word document accessible, how to make a PowerPoint accessible, so the base, how to make a PDF accessible, videos, how to caption videos, and making web pages content accessible. All of this is being created, and then the training is going to be provided in person, some of it virtually, and then recorded for future availability as well. We've got training manuals that we've created, and all of this is going to be housed, and some of it's already there on our portal, so that it can be accessed, because we want, eventually the goal is that anyone who creates electronic content to be consumed by others must be created from the get-go in an accessible format. So that's our ultimate goal, is what we're aiming for. So this training is initial plus ongoing annual training. We also realized that we needed to hire a person who would be in charge of the oversight of this process and then the ongoing maintenance and review to ensure that we are continuing to create materials and be as accessible as possible. So we have hired an EIT coordinator who is going to be that liaison to help manage that oversight. And in your library, even if you don't hire a new person to fill that role, it would be helpful to designate one person who would be that go-to person, who would be the EIT liaison with the rest of the university or throughout the rest of your library. Another thing that we thought would be really helpful is to have procurement be part of our conversation. So we have been working for quite a while with procurement on updating our policies that require, when we look for new technologies that require that we get VPATs or assurances from vendors on the accessibility of their product, and that accessibility is actually part of the conversation. We actually have created on our legal team, our Assistant General Counsel has created an EIT addendum, and that addendum is required for any contract that has technology involved, and so it spells out what the vendor is responsible for, what we are responsible for. So ultimately, the university is on the hook for providing material in an accessible format. So in our addendum, we are asking that either the vendor must correct any problems if they are identified, they must make that material accessible, or that we can have access to the product so that we can make that material accessible ourselves to provide to the student. But that EIT addendum has been really, really helpful in working with vendors. Then we turn to physical spaces. So we have a working group that is looking at developing master guidelines for setting up EIT in physical spaces. So this is our physical classrooms, our labs, our meeting spaces, but again, it's the electronic content. It's not the physical space. It's not how tall is your desk, how wide is your access lane. It's not that. We're looking at electronic information. So do we have accessible clickers and podiums? That's another important thing, having adjustable podiums that could be helpful for users. And that it also has if there's technology embedded in the podium, that it can be used by someone who needs some help with accessibility. Also, we're giving guidelines to instructors on things they can do in their classroom to improve accessibility, making sure they use high contrast markers on whiteboards, that they take into consideration how large the classroom is, and we're giving them guidelines on how large the letter height needs to be based on how many feet away the students are from the board. Some of our PowerPoint trainings, because instructors rely on PowerPoints very heavily, is that they use sans serif fonts, and if it's going to be a presentation that is projected on a screen, not like a webinar format, but projected on a screen, that they don't go any smaller than an 18-point font, because that's really hard for low vision viewers to see if it's smaller than 18. That they describe any images or charts that they're sharing and any other information that's presented visually, and also being very careful with that color contrast. So like on our screen here, it's mostly a white background with dark lettering. The title banner has the dark blue with the gold. Well, we ran that through a color contrast checker just to make sure that it did meet the contrast requirements for accessibility. So small things like that that can really make a huge difference, even in that face-to-face classroom or in your face-to-face library as well. So we're developing those master guidelines, and then farthest reaching, one of the last things we're looking at is the accessibility of other technology equipment. So the kiosks in our dining area, our vending machines, do they have the tactile buttons? Do they have the sound, the voice that speaks the options? Digital signage, anything that we have presented in a digital format on screens, that there's also an audio version available. So it's very, very wide reaching. And then I've got this as the last bullet, but it's really the first thing that we did is create an accessibility web page on our public facing page and one on our internal portal that includes a number of things. It includes the contact information for our disability services offices, for our ADA coordinator, for our EIT coordinator. It has a link to our grievance process. We have created a barrier report. So we decided to allow students to and visitors to the website, so it doesn't have to be a student, but they can let us know of any type of barrier, not just an electronic barrier. And that barrier report goes directly to the EIT coordinator so that that person can work on getting the right people in place to remediate whatever the problem is. And then the last thing is adding a link to accessibility, to that accessibility page in the footer of all of our web pages. So we've been working on that behind the scenes. We got the final mock-up approved, and that should go live in the next couple of weeks. So those are the main steps of what we are doing with our initiative. It's a very high-level overview with just a little bit of detail in the weeds. So Cheryl and I would be happy at this time to take any questions that you may have for us.
Sorry for the delay there. Thank you, Casey and Cheryl. That was really great. And so as she said, we do now have time for questions for the first portion of today's webinar, and we'll get started. We have a few that have already been submitted. We have a couple regarding the automated testing tool that you mentioned. Would you be able to share a little more information of that? What was it called? Is it open source, or was it something that someone would have to subscribe to or pay for?
Cheryl, do you want to tackle that one?
I'm happy to. So we use actually a number of them, but one that we have found very helpful is Site Improve, and there is a Chrome extension for Site Improve that is free, and I will send that link out to Erin as the organizer, and she can share it more widely with the group.
Absolutely. We'll include that in the list of unanswered questions that we send out.
Okay.
All right, next question is, how long did the agency take to complete the audit for your institution?
So they took about, start to finish, it was probably about 90 days. But again, I think I mentioned that we had kind of had a partial meeting beforehand just to get a sense of their general findings in general category buckets without having, you know, all of the specifics necessarily. But start to finish was about 90 days.
All right, thank you. And next question, if our university as a whole is not doing this in a coordinated way, what are some smaller steps that the library alone could take to get started?
Casey may want to speak more broadly, but I will say that you could absolutely take advantage of that Site Improve Chrome extension. There are other tools as well that are available to kind of look at content and identify any accessibility issues. but Casey might have some ideas on things that you could do more practically.
Yeah,
So
sure.
I'll give Casey an opportunity.
So if your institution isn't ready to jump on the accessibility bandwagon, but you want to tackle this within your library, you can certainly do most of the steps we discussed on a much smaller scale. So as Cheryl mentioned, there is a Chrome extension, a free version of Site Improved, and Cheryl's going to provide that link. There is a paid version as well that is more robust. You can negotiate with the vendor on pricing, but there are a lot of other options out there that you may want to demo, and then you can start doing some remediation on your own. So start using some of these tools. You could also conduct some surveys with your visitors to the libraries, specifically asking what types of enhancements would they like to see? What are some accessibility barriers that they have? And that may give you some ideas of the problems that they are encountering that maybe you aren't even aware of. Run some analytics on your web pages to see what are the pages that students are going to most frequently, what are the databases that they're using most frequently, are those pages that you've had complaints about, or are those vendors that don't seem to have as much accessible content as you would like to see. And then if that's the case, you can do a couple of things with vendors. You could either, if you're in the middle of a contract, you can go ahead and talk with them about some of the concerns that have come up and strategize with them on the best way to remediate those. Many times they will partner with you to an extent. Or you could also talk to them and get their permission to allow you to convert inaccessible material into an accessible format for your students. As you get closer to contract renewal, you may want to take a look at incorporating EIT addendums in your conversation and your contracts. And I have gotten permission from our Assistant General Counsel to share out our EIT addendum. If that would be helpful, I could provide that to Aaron, who could share that as well. And then you could also take a look at for yourselves. Do some trainings. There's so much information out there that you can self-train on how to create accessible content. So you can take that back to those pages that you ran the analytics on to see which ones the students are using the most. Then dig into those pages. Do you have PDFs on those pages that are perhaps not accessible? Do you have videos on those pages that are not captioned? So there's so many things that you could do, or your library could do, just for your library website. But you could also be a little more strategic about it by creating some materials of your own that you may then share out with your instructors. Hey, did you know that when you're creating a PowerPoint, you could do this and this and this? And that way all students can consume that material much more easily. So you can start pushing for some reform throughout your institution by first doing it on your side and then spreading the word of what you're doing.
Great, thank you. And thank you for offering to share the addendum. That was actually one of the next questions. Would you be willing to share that? So that's something else I can send out. That'd be great.
Sure.
And then we have time for one more question, and this is regarding EIT procurement procedures. One of our attendees' concerns is if faculty want the library resource that is unique and is not currently available following accessibility guidelines, will they be unable to get it? Is that situation being talked about? Is there existing verbiage about working towards allowing these resources to be purchased?
I think that Elizabeth might have more information about that in her next presentation because of what Seton Hall's library went through. I can tell you from our perspective, we are not under any type of monitoring or resolution agreement. We are doing this voluntarily because we want to do this. But I know that some of those enforcement agreements do require that material must be accessible or you cannot use it. So it really just depends on where you are with your institution, if you're under any type of monitoring agreement, but then also as an institution, how much do you want to stand up for accessibility? So at our institution at SNU, what we have chosen to do at the end of this project, once we get through all of the remediation and the training and the awareness and everyone knows what we're supposed to be doing, we are going to be requiring that instructors choose the most accessible version of materials that's out there. Now, there's some things you just won't be able to make accessible, and that's through, it's just not possible. You know, a flight simulator, you can't make it accessible to a blind user, you just can't. So you just kind of have to gauge for yourself, unless you're under a monitoring agreement, what your comfort level is.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we had a couple of unanswered questions. Again, those will be provided to Casey and Cheryl, and we'll answer them in writing, and we'll send that out with the rest of the information that they've agreed to share. And so now we will move on to the second portion of today's webinar, and there will be a slight delay as we change presenters to Elizabeth Leonard.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now? My name is Elizabeth Leonard, and I am the Assistant Dean of Information Technologies and Collection Services at Seton Hall University Libraries. And I'm going to be talking about our experience going through the Voluntary Resolution Agreement and some of the changes that we made in the library. So for those of you who don't know, Seton Hall, this is us. The library's in the lower left corner there, and a view of the campus is on the right. We are one of the country's leading Catholic universities. If you know about us, however, it is probably because of our basketball team, Go Pirates. We have about 10,000 students between graduate and undergraduate, which weighs more heavily these days than the undergraduate, as our freshman classes have been increasing. And we are opening a medical school in less than a month. So it's all very exciting. We have a lot going on here. So our background. We always felt that we had a very good history of meeting the needs of people with disabilities. We have had years worth of one-on-one meetings with students to make sure that their needs were being met on an individual basis. In some cases, we discovered that the software that they were using didn't necessarily interface with the vendor software. In the case of, you know, some of our database vendors and whatnot. As you all may know, the database vendors do design their products to work with screen readers, but there are a lot of different screen readers out there. And so in the case where it doesn't work as expected with a particular one, we facilitated a conversation between our vendors, which included EBSCO and ProQuest, to talk to the vendor's accessibility team and the student so that they could have a real world experience of exactly what's going on with this particular issue with the software and how the workflow might work better and things like that. And we've had very positive experiences with that. And the students have been very happy to participate. We supported ensuring equal access to articles and ebooks. If we discovered an article that was not accessible, we did take the steps, either working with our Disability Support Services Department at the school or through our own endeavors to scan it in, OCR, to make sure that it was a compliant item. And we similarly worked with ebooks as well. So we created these accessible materials for students. We had a good relationship with our disability support services, and that's really important, even historically, even going forward. You need to make sure that your disability support services knows who they can reach out to in the library to make sure that their students are helpful, so that they don't send the student over to the library without having a touch person there. And so we had a strong relationship with them, and we knew which students might be walking through the door within a certain level of privacy, that these types of students might need help. And disability could pick up the phone and call us and say, we have a particular student, student X, who is having problems with this in this particular subject. Can we make an appointment? And so they facilitated that relationship as well. We were lucky enough that the building, which I showed you, was built in the last 30 years or so, so the accessibility issues were minimal with the physical space. But when we redid our information commons, we were very careful to make sure that we had accessible workstations, adjustable height tables, you know, larger keyboards and accessible mice, and a variety of other things, including adjustable height monitors, et cetera, et cetera. So we were very, very proud of that. We did also pay attention to Section 508 and our website and our reading to make sure that we hit what I would call the low-hanging fruit for accessibility. to make sure that most of the things that we thought we were able to take care of were in fact hit. We also implemented a number of services at our library that would help make sure that while they helped everybody, they particularly helped students who have varying abilities. We took our multifunction devices, our printer, scanner, fax type machines that were available out in the information commons, and we turned on optical character recognition, or OCR, as a default option. That way, if somebody scanned an article in and they produced a PDF, that PDF would be readable by a screen reader by default. So that was not a default option on our printers, and it was very difficult to find if you wanted to do it manually. So we were very pleased to turn that on, so that makes sure that if somebody had to scan something in themselves, it was ready for a screen reader. We implemented 2 policies, one which is a get it at circ option, which allows the student or patron using our catalog to click on the hold button, enter in their information, and our circulation staff or access services staff would pull the book from the shelf and have it ready at the circulation desk for them. This was a benefit to all students, but especially students who, for whatever reason, might have trouble stooping down to the lowest shelves or might have trouble reaching the higher shelves. So they could ask for materials, and within a couple hours, they were ready for them. The other policy that we had was that we had ILL of print articles. And so in the same way that we would pull pull monographs and books from our stacks and have them at the circ desk, we would go to our journal holdings, our print journal holdings, pull out the journal, take the article, scan it in, our ILL staff did that, and then email it directly to the requester. That way they did not have to worry about managing, if they had issues with working with physical books or opening up those very large journals, they're very big when they bind them together, that they would be just simply sent to them. However, this was not enough. We learned in May of 2017 that a complaint had been entered prior to that to the Office of Civil Rights, which is the Department of Education. We did learn that this complaint was not made by a Seton Hall person. There are several people in the US who have made a habit of entering in complaints about various schools, and they do 500 a month or something and then post it on their website. And that's how we discovered who made the complaint about us. I will note on the side that the Office of Civil Rights has made a change in the way that they investigate complaints, and that they are no longer investigating complaints by people who are what one might term as professional complainers, the type of person who put in a complaint about our website. However, we chose to move forward with the agreement and chose to move forward with the resolution because there are also law firms who are now looking at creating class action suits, and they would be seeking monetary damages. So between those 2 options, we felt that it was best to work with Office of Civil Rights, and frankly, they've really been great. So to circle back to the actual presentation, we received this complaint in May of 2017, and when you get that complaint, then you have 90 days to respond. It addressed our public web presence. It did not address a physical complaint of a physical space. It was entirely about our public web. The law in the books at the time that the complaint was made was Section 508, and that essentially hit about a standard of WCAG 1.0. But what we were unaware of was that in January of 2017, the Section 508 was updated to include the WCAG 2.0 AA standard, which is a much more stringent standard. So the university web department and the university library web department and the athletics department, who has their own very robust space, tried very hard to comply to go fix the errors and the issues that were noted before the voluntary resolution agreement period would have been signed, that 90-day period. And then we discovered that there was just too much to do. Especially, when we have videos, as athletics departments often do, they don't have any closed captioning, and there just was too much to remediate. So it was decided to sign the voluntary resolution agreement, which we did in 2017. Now, for those of you who don't exactly know what this is, I pulled this from the OCR site, and I will read it if there is somebody here who is have limited sight. It is a written resolution agreement that describes the specific remedial actions that the recipient will undertake to address the areas of non-compliance identified by OCR. The terms of the resolution agreement, if fully performed, will remedy the identified violations in compliance with the applicable civil rights laws. So that's what that is. At this point, I'm going to break down what the VRA does entail in the majority. I've read quite a few of them at this point, from university level to K-12, et cetera, and talking about the components that the majority of them have and what each one of those sections, the expectation for each one of those sections. There are generally 5 parts. There is an audit, a notice, a corrective action plan, a plan for new content, and a training section. And remember, I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV. And I am just simply relaying information that I have gleaned from research, as most librarians do, over a wide variety of VRAs. So let's talk about the audit. The audit is very similar to what Casey and Cheryl were talking about. We review our public-facing website by an independent third-party company, and this is an organization that is agreed upon by OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, and our institution. So they say, okay, we're going to use this company, and Office of Civil Rights says, fine, we know that that's an ethical company. The audit does talk about what benchmark it will be using. In our case, it was WCAG 2.0 AA, and that is pretty much standard. Although I guess if WCAG 2.0 is coming, 2.1 is coming out, that VRAs in the future will start to incorporate those. There were 2 parts to the testing. One was an automated testing using a corporate platform like Site-Improve. In fact, we did use Site-Improve just as Casey and Cheryl used. We found it very good, both as the site level corporate, the automatic level, and as the manual Chrome add-on. Both were excellent. So we used Site-Improve to take a look at the entire site, and then there was manual testing by the third-party company, by the auditor, who then did manual checks using various tools, screen readers and things like that to check the actual functionality. Your institution, depending on the agreement that was created, the institution may be required to seek input from members of the public. In other words, you may have to go get a focus group of people who include your patrons. So you might have students from your disability support office, or you might have faculty, or even members of your public if your school uses them, or excuse me, allows their presence in your library, to bring them in and to do focus groups. How does it actually work? You think it works great? How does it actually work? What are the things that need to be changed? The audit, which takes about 90 days, I agree with Casey and Cheryl. I think that was about the time that it took from beginning to when we received the report, lists the non-compliant areas and issues that need to be fixed. And this information in this audit will guide the corrective action plan. Now, the date to be performed and completed was generally negotiable with the institution. It was generally no more than 180 days after signing of the VRA. I believe ours started 90 days after, within 90 days after the VRA was signed, and was delivered within that 180-day period. The notice. Now, you have to, if you've signed a VRA, you will have to put a notification on your website of how inaccessible content will be reported to the webmaster. You have to put this notice on every page, or some link to the notice on every page, showing documentation of how things will be taken care of, the submission form, et cetera, et cetera. The notice and the VRA generally also include the designation of a web accessibility coordinator, and this person is a specific individual at your institution who will ensure that content is accessible, will make sure that training happens among the individuals at the institution who create web content, will perform continuing accessibility audits, and that person will receive notification of the accessibility violations. And in this case, this is the footer on every one of our web pages. And it goes to a page that explains how important accessibility is. It's a continuous process. If you have any issues, then fill out this web accessibility issue page, and that goes to our web accessibility coordinator, who will then reach out to either within his team, because he does all of the websites except for the library website and athletics, and notify them that there's an issue. So he either fixes it himself or tells us. The corrective action plan. The corrective action plan essentially says, okay, here's a snapshot of your website. How are you going to fix everything that we found that is a problem? So it designs it's a plan designed to address inaccessible content and all the functionality identified during the audit. It may include legacy pages, it may not. If your voluntary resolution agreement may include information that says, you only have to fix everything from 2015 forward. If this web page has not been touched since before that time, then it does not have to be addressed. If you go into and edit that page and add a comma, it becomes subject to the resolution agreement. So what we had in our particular case, we did have archival materials left off, which was helpful. How much of modifying existing content? Again, the archival content may be left off, it may not be. The date ranges in creating this corrective action plan will range from 30 to 60 days after the completion of your audit. So you receive it on X day, between 30 and 60 days, your university or your organization has to write a corrective action plan and submit it to OCR for approval. There's also a section about plan for new content. How are you going to make sure that everything created from today on meets accessibility standards? How do you make sure that it is accessible and able to be read by a screen reader or a number of individuals? There is an implementation plan built into that. Adopting policies to ensure that future content continues to be in compliance. For example, your e-resources, and I can, the question that was asked by one of the attendees, I can answer in more detail when we get to the question and answer session. You know, what happens when you deal with vendors who have some compliance, do not have some compliance? There are issues of equal burden or fundamental alteration. Cheryl and Casey, I don't remember which one, I'm sorry, mentioned a flight simulator is never going to be accessible. So that would be a specific issue in which you have an undue burden or fundamental alteration. It's going to change the entire piece of educational information. I think another one is ChemBioDraw, which is now ChemDraw, is another one that we ran into. Well, there's really no way to make that. It's really would be almost impossible to make it accessible. And again, documentation is the cornerstone of your voluntary resolution agreement. Training. So you have to train your appropriate personnel, and that includes content developers, webmasters, anyone responsible for developing, maintaining, auditing content. In the library, it was anybody creating libguides, or LibGuides if you prefer that pronunciation. We here use, our website is built on the SpringShare platform. So it included anybody who created the website, all of our librarians who are all of our subject liaisons, anybody down in archives who created finding aids or any other public-facing content. And that was immediate training and ongoing throughout the process. And then we have to send in semi-annual training reports submitted to OCR. So now I'm going to spend the rest of the time that I have talking about some of the VRA changes, the changes that we made as a result of our of the voluntary resolution agreements and our experience. So this is a very basic shot of our web page as it now stands, things that we changed. We our first thing was when, as soon as we got this complaint, we went through and we reviewed every single page of our public content. That was 1,100 plus pages. And at the time, we did not have a institutional subscription to Cite and Prove, so we did it using the Chrome extension, one page at a time. We created a task force within the library. We had those who had some understanding, or at least enough of a comfortable understanding of technology, go through and look at every single page, and you can see some of them listed here, and the guides, what group it was in, the friendly URL, who reviewed it. This is a final review, so it's mostly me. The date that we reviewed it, and any issues that were outstanding. And so then we kind of created a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 structure. So the basic web pages we're just looking at and saying, this is fine, this guide is not fine, no, this has a problem. Then they went to the second tier, which was more so the low-hanging fruit, our HTML, missing tags, tags of that were once popular but are no longer able to be read by screen readers. For example, the bold tag can't be used anymore, the B tag in HTML, now you need the strong tag. Strong can be read by a screen reader, the bold tag, the B cannot. Then above that, things that needed real programming, and we are lucky enough to have had, or we have a developer, a coder on campus, on our, in our library, excuse me. And he was able to deal with the majority of that, or we escalated issues off to our vendor, in this case for the public-facing website with SpringShare. And I will say SpringShare was fantastic about working with us to make sure that issues were dealt with. And they were dealing with other libraries across the country and across the world who were also trying to bring items into compliance. They were extremely responsive. We had to stop and think about who we were creating our website and with differing abilities. And I know this was dealt with slightly in the previous presentation, so I'll skip over most of this. But when we think about disabled students or students with differing abilities, we usually think of people who are blind. And we had to stop and think about that in a different way. So color blindness was also an issue. So you have to think about the contrast or the colors that you're choosing. If you're choosing reds and greens and blues, are those going to be able to be seen at some level, or the difference of those? If you choose red and green to differentiate colors or differentiate things on the screen, will somebody who has color blindness be able to see the differences in those colors? They'll see two muddy browns or something. People with learning disabilities like dyslexia, there are fonts that are better, sans serif fonts versus serif fonts that, and sans serif fonts are generally better. I hope I got that right. I come from a family of dyslexics, so I tend to mix these things up. To make sure that you use that type of font, which are easier for dyslexics to read. Physical movements, people who, if you can't be able to use a mouse very well, you have to be able to use the keyboard or some other way to tab through a page. So is the page organized in a logical way with the headers, because that's how screen readers jump from level to level, is to be using screen readers. Hearing disorders. You have to either have subtitles, closed captioning, open captioning, or transcripts available to people. And even people who are older, who have issues with neuroplasticity, and making sure that the content path is simple, so you don't have to click 6 different ways to Sunday to get to content. I will skip over this because we did cover it briefly in the previous group presentation. We also changed the way that we did things at the library. Now, we were really proud of what we'd done, but we realized that that we could do better. And that's really important. We realized that supporting students with differing abilities was an iterative approach. It wasn't just a single, okay, we've done, wipe our hands and move on to the next thing. We moved from a single disability liaison, who happened to be me, actually, to a team approach. So we've trained more people to work with students with differing abilities. And so that if a student has a problem, they could reach out and say they were a graduate student and they're here more likely in the evening than the daytime. I'm not here in the evening. They were more likely to be able to meet up with somebody more quickly because there was going to be somebody in the evening who'd be able to help them. We, again, talked more with our disability services. We said, okay, how can we do better? We did do focus groups and interviews with, and more talking with our students with disabilities, and not just one type of student with disabilities. We talked with we talked with different types of students with differing abilities. And we also, when we undertook our own education, we learned what it was like to be differently abled. So we downloaded screen readers There are a number of free ones out there. I happen to be suggesting Chromevox here. I think it's relatively simple to use. And you close your eyes or you turn your head away from the screen and actually try to navigate your website or other websites. Try to navigate Facebook with a screen reader, and you will have an understanding of the challenges that students with different abilities have. Or try to use a different type of mouse, or try to use your keyboard to navigate a page using the tab headers. It's not that easy. Working with your vendors. Depending on your voluntary resolution agreement, vendor content may be your content, especially when it hosts material created by your libraries. So SpringShare has your content. Institutional repositories like bpress's Digital Commons or their selected works, this is your content, and this stuff must come in line. Drupal, SpringShare, exhibition software like Omeka or Preservica or ArchiveSpace, all of those may be subject to your voluntary resolution agreement and all have your content, and so therefore it is subject to the agreement. I will say again that our vendors, I did not list a vendor that was unsupportive. In fact, I don't think we had one who was unsupportive of the need to meet the standards. Not all of them met the standards, but they were all very interested in trying to meet the standards. In terms of acquisitions and licensure, we have, the VPAT, as was mentioned. It's really, though, you need more than the VPAT, because you reach out to your vendors and you say, hi, I'd like to talk to you about accessibility. They send you a copy of the VPAT. The VPAT that they've probably sent you is probably the old one from before the WCAG 2.0, and so it's out of date, and so they need to do a new one. One of our vendors said, well, this is the one that we have, and we're really sorry, but it's a real pain in the neck to fill these out. So yeah. So what would be best to do in addition to the VPATs is to add languages to your licenses to make sure that they are aware of the need to make these materials accessible. And the key language that we are finding that's very important is if the product doesn't comply, the licensee, that's us, has the right to adapt the materials to meet the student standards. So if there is an article that isn't accessible, we can print it out, we can scan it in, we can change it and alter the content ourselves without violating the terms of the license. And that's really important, because beforehand, you were very limited in how you could use your content according to the license. This allows you to make sure that the content is available for everyone. What it comes down to is that e-resource vendors that couldn't comply had to be removed from our holdings. We have and I have another year or so to continue to work through accessibility with all of our vendors and adding this to our licensure, that we either have to remove them from holdings or approved as an exception by the president of the university or by their designee. And so what this means is if I have database X and they say, we're really sorry, we created this platform 25 years ago before all of this came along, and we don't have the money to change it. If that item is not considered extremely important, if it's not necessary for accreditation, we've had to let some of those resources go. We've had one so far, we're looking at a couple more. Ones that are important for accreditation, we have to write up and have that approved by the president of the university or the president's designee, and have that approved as an exception to the policy. The last thing I would suggest that everybody do is that you push on education. Education is so important. You cannot get enough of it. We have taken several courses here. I've personally taken one or two exceptionally good ones, and learning more, and I will not stop there. I will continue to take, there are some advanced classes that I'm looking at, just making sure that the timing lines up with the time that we have. All of these websites have some very good information about accessibility. The GitHub one has been a very good repository for bringing together a number of courses available across the interwebs. And A11Y is a great project. I would take a look at that if you have a chance. So at this point, I'm hoping that we have questions that I can help answer for you.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So let's get started by revisiting the question from the first session. You mentioned it a few slides ago. The question was about any kind of standards or suggestions for when a faculty member requests that a tool be purchased, but it's not available in a way that meets our accessibility requirements?
Right. So what we did is that we have revised our collection development policy, number one, and we have said it has to meet standards. If it doesn't meet standards, we're very sorry. The exception to that, obviously, is if a product that they are requesting is absolutely crucial to meet accreditation. So if it's, I don't want to give out any database names that aren't, it would not be nice, but there are ones out there. But I have to have this or we're not going to make accreditation standards. But most of the time we sit down and the liaison faculty, the library liaison sits down with the faculty member and says, we're really sorry. This is a federal requirement. In our case, it's a federal requirement and the president of the university will not allow us to purchase it.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we had a question about, for those of us working with LibGuides or LibGuides, you had mentioned that you worked really closely with SpringShare. Beyond working directly with them, are there any additional tips you can give for those working with LibGuides, or is it kind of rolled into the system now that you've been working with SpringShare?
Yeah, I have, so one of the things that I do is training, and I actually have several levels of training that I give, one to everybody who creates materials, and that's just the basic check the contrast checker. I think WebAIM has a very good contrast checker where you can take a look at the colors and make sure that there's enough of a contrast between the background and the foreground. There are making sure that your tags, your bold tags and your italic tags, which I call bold and italics, but now are properly considered in HTML as strong and, oh, is it, of course I blanked on it. Emphasis, no, I'm sorry, it begins with an E, I'm almost certain. So the whatever is called italics now, and I'm sorry, somebody can Google that, to make sure that those are taken care of, to make sure that you're using your heading tags correctly. In SpringShare, the page is, the actual web page is automatically tagged H1. And the box on the page is automatically tagged H2, which is why when you go into SpringShare and create their content, that it starts at H3 as a default. But you shouldn't use those. A lot of people have a tendency to use those sort of as formatting tools, style tools, and they shouldn't be. They should be used as sort of outlining tools. So if you think about you creating your content using an outlining organizational structure, that's how you should use those. Instead of saying, oh, look, if I apply H3, it's 18 points in bold. That's great. I want to do that because I want that 2 words to stand out in the middle of my page. You need to apply the bold tags and the emphasis tags to do those. The other thing that I can suggest that you do if you're implementing this type of thing is that SpringShare has what's called a publishing workflow, and we've leveraged that to work with our accessibility. So whenever people create content, they submit, rather than just publishing it or making changes to it and publishing it, they submit their guide to the publishing workflow, and I get a notification, or one of the people here who are trained to do it, and then we literally go in and we walk through each one of those pages using the Site Improve add-on tool and look at each page and then remediate any content that is outside of the WCAG standard and fix that. One of the things that you often find is if you grab a YouTube video, which should have closed captioning if you grabbed it, but if you grab a YouTube video and you embed it as an iframe, it embeds in an old style that a screen reader can't read. So I literally, every time somebody goes in and embeds a YouTube video, I generally either have to check or rewrite the iframe code to properly format for screen readers. And I could go on for days and hours. This is something that it cannot be encompassed in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or even an hour. I would suggest taking some classes. And there are lots of free ones out there.
Great, thank you. That is a lot of useful information. And I did Googling on the side here. It is the emphasize tag.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. And then we do have one more question. Do you have specific licensing language for ILS vendors regarding accessibility compliance?
So what I would suggest is, if you take a look at the second bullet here, the add languages to licenses, the first, actually both of those have very good language. I particularly like the ARL link, which is the first link there, because it goes far beyond you can say, there are so many different ways to do this. And if you work with the largest vendors, they're going to have the language that they already want to use, which favors them always. But it is enough for you. And it is enough to show that you are working towards higher accessibility standards. The ARL one, to circle back to it, I particularly like because it talks about not just meeting a WCAG 2.0 standard, but also to make sure that it is integrated with screen readers or other assistive devices. There is other language out there that I talked about with making sure that the material is adapted. I think that's really, really helpful, and that was in the crl.edu link. And there's also, I've seen some much more stringent policies out there, and we don't have the political clout to be able to pull it in, but to say, if you don't do this, then we have the right to, if you don't fix this, then we have the right to walk away from our contract. I've never been able to get that one passed. The other thing is, if we get sued, we are indemnified, and it's on you vendor, not us, university, that the problem. That's one that I've had some success with, but very, very little.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was so helpful. And this will conclude our presentations today. We're so glad that all of you could be with us, our attendees, and you will soon receive a short online evaluation form as well as the slide deck and recording. But if you could please take a few minutes to respond to the questions in the evaluation form, your comments are very valuable, and it does help our continuing education committee plan future events. You'll also have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will be included in the email. Thanks again to our presenters, Casey Fleetwood, Cheryl Irvin, and Elizabeth Leonard, and to members of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, Mary Aycock and Joseph Nicholson, and to the ALCTS Office Representative Megan Doherty, as well as our co-sponsors. The ALCTS webinar season will wrap up with tomorrow's second part of the virtual pre-conference, which will discuss current practices in accessibility online, on campus, and in the marketplace. And registration for this session is still open, which you can find at the link shown on your screen. ALCTS also has two pre-conference events taking place at ALA Annual on June 22nd. You can please see the website for details and registration. One will be on technical services assessment, tools and techniques that demonstrate, and one will be on hacking acquisitions, tools and apps for better acquisitions workflows. And finally, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and this will conclude today's session.